I'm going to talk today about geography of the American economy. And I'm going to start off with some general remarks about how cities have fared over the last 20 years. Much of that material comes from my book, The Triumph of the City, which was published in 2011. And if you're interested in more of that, there's a YouTube channel and an edX course called Cities X, which has no less than 187 videos of me talking to people about cities throughout the world. And then I'll talk specifically about what I see as perhaps America's largest unsolved social problem, which is the rise of prime-age joblessness in this country and its geographic concentration. And then I'm going to finish up a little bit on what I think we can potentially do to make this country into a better place on this. But let me start with cities. So what I'm showing you up right here is, in some sense, a map of America. What I've done is I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the United States, and I've split them into tenths, right? Each one of these dots represents 300 counties, and I've ordered them on the basis of their population density levels. Because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. Now, the blue line, the lower line, shows the relationship between density and earnings. The densest tenth of America's counties have earnings that are 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This connection between density, between area size, and earnings and productivity is one of the most central facts in economic geography. It's something economists call agglomeration economies, and many things are wound up in it. Part of it reflects the fact that sometimes perhaps more able people choose to locate in cities. Certainly, residents of large cities like to think they are innately more able. Some of it perhaps reflects the existence of certain natural advantages, like a deep port in New York City, which both generates productivity and then attracts people. But I would say that, on net of the past 40 years of work on this, the scientific consensus has come down to the view that much of this is just the fact that being around other people makes you more productive. And indeed, if you are not experiencing some fraction of that at Villanova, you're screwing up. Because, in fact, the great advantage of being at a place like this is that you are surrounded by talent, and you should be taking advantage of that all the time. And indeed, in some sense, the most important thing that cities do is that they enable us to learn from people around us. For thousands of years, cities have been enabling these collaborative chains of creativity that are empowering humanity's greatest hits, since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner, down to the creation of Facebook in a college dorm 15 years ago at Harvard. Now, the top line shows the relationship between population growth and density. So what you can see there again is that the more density there was in the initial period, which is 2000, the faster population growth has been. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard, like Philadelphia, to occupy the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we are clustering in. This is the exact same graphs for the European Union. In this case, I'm using NUTS 3 regions. And what you can see here, this is the GDP line, is the blue line. And that relationship is actually stronger than the US. The densest tenth of European regions have earnings that are twice as high as the least dense tenth. The population growth relationship is somewhat weaker, primarily because Europeans migrate much less than Americans do. But it shows the basic fact. This shows the relationship between proximity to city centers and housing price growth over the past 20 years. So what you can see here is the great tilt that's occurred. In the 1980s and the 1970s, the suburbs were hot. People were willing to pay a premium to get away from the crime and danger that was associated with living in a big city. Over the past 20 years, that has reversed itself. And any of you who have looked to rent an apartment or have friends who've looked to rent an apartment, let's say in downtown Philadelphia near Rittenhouse Square, this should ring pretty true to you. These are areas which are no longer urban bargains to be snapped up. They're places in which competition for the fun, the excitement, the joys of being in an urban space have pushed up prices. Some of that is a positive aspect of rising demand for cities, but part of it also reflects the limited supply of space. And I'm not going to focus a lot on this, but it's sort of an important thing for you to recognize that over the past 50 years, America has made it increasingly difficult to build in the most attractive parts of the United States, be it the New York area, be it the greater Washington area, or especially the Bay Area of San Francisco, which has, over the past 20 years, become probably the most productive place on the planet. But as opposed to most of the time where American places have experienced enormous productivity surges, instead of having millions of people come in, as they did into the tenements of New York in 1900, or as they did to the rich soil of the Ohio River Valley, today huge amounts of zoning, of local land use regulation, make it impossible for ordinary people to be part of the Silicon Valley magic. And that's a cost that the whole country pays of having those local land use regulations. Okay, now the recent success of cities reflects changing technology, right? Technologies have been shaping urban form for millennia. And I've put up this picture of an aqueduct for a couple of reasons. The first of which is there is no more important job of city government than providing clean water, because there is no crime wave that kills as swiftly as a cholera epidemic. And I can't think of any technology that has been more important for the long-term survival of cities than actually the aqueduct. Right? The urban civilizations of Rome were impossible to imagine without these feats of engineering that enabled clean water to come in, and then other pieces of technology which enabled the filth to move out, like the Cloaca Maxima that the Etruscans built in the 6th century. This is what we call a centripetal technology. It's a technology that pulls people in to big cities. And indeed, the 19th century was a centripetal century. It was a century in which a variety of technological innovations, starting with the omnibus, right, the horse-drawn omnibus. This is the things that came before the mainline trains or the buses that we now see on cities. But those horse-drawn omnibuses would go up and down Broadway in New York, enabling the city to sprawl out. And then, of course, this quintessential urban technology, the skyscraper. A skyscraper is not just a tall building. It's a tall building with a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton. The critical element in a skyscraper is that what's underneath this is steel, and then those bricks are just hung like a curtain on top of it. It makes it possible to go up much more cheaply, and of course the other thing that's a critical part of the skyscraper technology is the safety elevator that Otis creates in 1848. Because in fact a skyscraper is really the marriage of a building technology with a transportation technology that enables a city to soar up rather than soaring out. And this is this centripetal century. By contrast, much of the 20th century was centrifugal. It was a century in which technologies like the automobile, radio, television enabled people to enjoy the pleasures of being in a city or to move around in low-density areas in a way that had never been possible before then. The car, of course, was a creation of the city. Mass-produced automobiles were generated in Detroit, which was a city that was, as entrepreneurial as Silicon Valley in the 1960s. It's not just about Henry Ford, it's about the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, Billy Durant nearby Flint, Ransom E. Olds, right? A genius on every street corner, who collectively managed to do this amazing thing of providing mobility for ordinary Americans at an affordable price. And yet this very mobility enabled people to move away from the older cities, all of which had been formed to reduce transportation costs. Right? Every one of the largest cities in the US in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, New York, Boston, typically where the river meets the sea, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. Right? All of those transportation cost advantages that were associated with water and then rail were blown away by highways and then the interstate highway system, right? By cars and the interstate highway system. And so people left cities. Factories left cities, right? We were looking at a new world in which urban America was a dinosaur headed for the trash heap of history. And when the largest industrial cluster in the 1950s in the United States was not automobile production in Detroit, it was garment production in New York City. Guys sewing clothes on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and then in the garment district. Right? That industrial cluster was slaughtered by globalization and technological change. And then in the 1980s, when I started to work on this type of thing, right, these guys had left, right, this was gone, and the question was, would anything remain? Would cities continue to exist in any way, shape, or form? Or would the new forms of information technology, right, and putting these up, because these were, believe it or not, these were the equivalent of smartphones in the 1980s, right? And these were the feared weapons that were going to make face-to-face contact and the cities that enable that contact obsolete. So why would we bother to come together to connect in meetings when we could just fax each other? Right? When we could just go to whatever electronic cottages we need off in whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia. Why would we need to be close to one another anymore when we had this stuff? Now, 25 years ago, actually closer to 30 years ago when I started working on cities, I thought that was probably wrong. That in fact it was unlikely that technology was likely to reverse millions of years of evolution that had made us a social species. And it's been a sort of amazing thing that over the past 25 years, cities have not gotten weaker, cities have gotten stronger, which is not to say that suburban America is dead in any way, shape, or form, which is not to say there isn't more population growth in suburbs and outside of it. But, the cities that were supposed to be headed for the trash heap of history have come back. They've come back in terms of productivity, they've come back in terms of income, they've come back in terms of population growth, and they've come back in terms of housing prices. And the rumor, the belief that all this information technology was going to kill off face-to-face contact has proved to be false. And one of the things that was striking even then, even 25 years ago, that sort of belied the notion that technology would make face-to-face contact obsolete, was that the most famous example of geographic concentration of industry was Silicon Valley, right, which was an industrial cluster where people actually wanted to be close to one another. If you thought that new technology was going to make face-to-face contact obsolete, why would Google buy the Googleplex? Why would it build a new, fairly amazing corporate headquarters so everyone would be right on top of each other, right? If all the companies in the world, the one that should be enabling long-distance working should be Google, and yet that's not their model. And that's not their model for a very good reason, which is they understand that human beings get smart by being around other smart people. They understand that human beings are a social species that lives by collaborating, that energizes, that we energize each other by being around in the same space. This is the Wallace office at Michael Bloomberg City Hall. There's another picture of it. That's based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP. That's based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Trading floors is something of an anomaly, right? Here we have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in a normal industry would, have offices like, I don't know, university deans, right? Big offices with big, desks protected by executive assistants. And here they are, right, in these, trading floors right on top of each other, yelling at each other, sweating on each other, getting food on each other, making a complete mess of the space. Why are they there? Why do trading floors exist? They exist because in that industry, knowledge is vastly more important than space. There's no industry where being a bit smarter can make you a lot richer more quickly than finance, right? And so this is an industry in which it is critical to know exactly what's going on in the world. And in that world, you want to be surrounded by people. They may be yelling, they may be screaming, but you want to actually know exactly what's going on in the markets. That is why trading floors look the way they are. That is why Bloomberg had this model, and that is fundamentally why cities came back. In a world in which knowledge and globalization have vastly increased the returns to human capital, have vastly increased the returns to talent, right? That is a world that is very friendly towards urbanization, towards being around smart people, towards being connected face to face, because that's how we learn. And any way that you in your own life, one of the things you'll find is that who you're surrounded by is going to determine how productive, how creative you are. People who come to cities don't experience a 30% wage gain overnight. What happens is that year by year, month by month in the wage data, they experience faster wage growth, which is really compatible with the view that cities are forges of human capital. The more complicated an idea is, the easier it is to get lost in translation. And we are now living in a more complicated world. Anyone who has ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your students at all. At all, okay? And face-to-face contact, right, being in the same room, enables us to use these cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. Now, of course, the comeback of cities is not uniform, right? Some cities have risen as capitals of the information age, others have not. It's easy to forget now, but in 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to turn out the lights. Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine Seattle with a smaller Boeing. Right? And Boeing had been cutting back on the number of jobs. This is before Amazon, before Costco, before Microsoft, and Starbucks is just beginning to brew. Seattle comes back, much more so than Detroit, primarily because of its skills. About 1/2 of Seattle's adults have college degrees. About 1/8 of Detroit's adults have college degrees. This is the relationship between the share of, you lost the x-axis on this. Along the x-axis is the share of adults with college degrees, okay? Running down from 10% down here up to 50% in San Jose and San Francisco. Enormous differences in productivity, right? This is a 4-fold difference in per capita GDP across America's metropolitan areas. Some areas look like they're in the developing world, and some areas are the most productive places on the planet. And education is the primary explanatory variable which captures this. Cities, like nations, and people rise or fall based on their human capital. And the reason why Detroit and Seattle look different is that those engineers at Boeing invested like crazy in the education of their children. This is the relationship between skills across counties and population growth between 2000 and 2010. Skills are powerful predictors of which areas have done well and which areas have done poorly, right? And indeed, new technologies have often come along to make cities stronger. Those technologies are used disproportionately by the skilled, right? But they're places that help cities to thrive, not just as places of production, but places of consumption, places of fun. This is Robin Chase, one of the founders of Zipcar. And Zipcar is one of these technologies, along with Airbnb, that bill themselves as harbingers of a sharing economy. Well, cities have always been about sharing. Having a lot of people around enables you to share things. What is an urban restaurant other than a shared dining room, a shared kitchen? What is an urban park other than a shared backyard? The difference is the new technologies enable you to share more stuff. So why didn't you have like Zipcar in 1975 in New York, right? So this is when I was 8 years old. Well, you'd go to Times Square to pick up your car, and there'd be like a dead body in the trunk, right? And that would be like a highly unpleasant experience. And now you have the technology, and so you don't need to worry, right? The idea that you would have had something like Uber, which is a predominantly urban thing, in 1975, that's laughable. This is what we thought cab drivers were like, and they were licensed, okay? The idea that you would have some stranger come to your house and trust them to take away yourself or your spouse, it's a non-starter. And yet, today we do it routinely because the technology has made it possible for us to trust. The technology has made it possible for us to share. Of course, the most important skills that matter for cities are not the skills that are taught in the classroom. They're the skills that are learned on the streets, at the breakfast table. They're what Alfred Marshall, the great English economist, was talking about when he wrote 130 years ago, that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade are no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. Well, I can think of no skill, no mystery that is more important than the talent and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 60 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh, and noting that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh was even then. He argued that this was a legacy of New York's industrial past, of its connection with the garment industry, which is an industry with very few returns to scale, very few barriers to entry, in which anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started and build a fortune. And so the garment industry was a mother of entrepreneurship. And the entrepreneurs who got started in garment trade went and did other things. They started movie studios. They built skyscrapers. They opened banks, because entrepreneurial human capital is fungible. If you're good at looking for new opportunities in one area, you're good at looking for new opportunities in another. And when the garment industry faltered, these entrepreneurs did different things. By contrast, Pittsburgh, because of those coal mines, because of those three rivers, right, Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel. And the middle managers of U.S. Steel were great at solving static problems. They were great at figuring out how to get the logistics of this thing working. But they were middle managers, not entrepreneurs. And when U.S. Steel faltered, New York's middle managers were not good at coming up with a new electronics birthday card company that would fill in the space, right? And so it took decades, and it's still taking decades, for Pittsburgh to recover itself, whereas New York managed to be resilient. It is amazing, given how mediocre our measures of entrepreneurship are, that they are so predictive of urban resilience. Along the x-axis here, I'm just split metropolitan areas into those ones that have the smallest average establishments, and these are the ones with the biggest average establishments. This is employment growth between 1977 and 2010. And what you see is those places that have a lot of little firms have had employment growth about 4 times higher than those places that have a few big firms. Okay? Entrepreneurial human capital is incredibly important. This isn't just about which sector of the country. It's not just about which industries are in it. No matter how you cut this data, you see a strong, powerful relationship that things that look like entrepreneurial human capital are strongly predictive of subsequent success. Now, I don't want to suggest everything is rosy in cities. I want to just give you two facts that should trouble you. This is the relationship between population density and per capita productivity. Okay? This comes from the work of my colleague Raj Chetty, who measures upward mobility. This is between kids who were born between 78 and 83, and ask what income percentile they're in today. Population density is strongly predictive of per capita productivity and strongly negatively predictive of upward mobility. So there's a puzzle that these cities that are so great at turning adult workers into machines for innovation, machines for making things, do such a poor job of taking care of their kids. And in some sense, that is a great challenge that high-density America still has to deal with. Similarly, this is actually using a regression discontinuity technique where you look at kids living just inside and just outside of the school district border. Right? And what you can see here is once you get right out of the school district border, your upward mobility leaps up, and your probability of being incarcerated in a jail as an adult goes down. Okay? In some sense, when you think about the cities of America, right, the fact that so many central city school districts fail their kids is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of cities, and it's one of the biggest deterrents to big city growth. And in some sense, the big challenge ahead is when we do have productive cities, cities that are thriving, we need to make sure that they are places that are providing upward mobility for everyone. right? We need to make sure that cities are ladders for moving upward. Not to suggest that there's a zero-sum nature to this. There isn't, right? This is not a battle of haves against have-nots. It's a battle to make sure that cities are places of hope and places of opportunity for everyone. And just before I move on, I just want to sort of remind you that cities have been doing miraculous stuff, right, for centuries, if not millennia. They've been enabling artistic revolutions and political changes. They brought together St. Augustine and St. Ambrose in Milan, right? There's sort of amazing miracles that go around us all the time in cities. And I can tell you very clearly that age of miracles is not gone, and that cities are still capable of doing unbelievable things. But that needs to be harnessed and made more useful for people who are starting with less. Okay, that's the first bit. Now the second bit, okay? The success of high human capital urban America is an amazing thing to witness. But there's also a part of urban America that is not benefiting in the same way. And there's a part of urban America where hope seems to be very absent. This looks at joblessness among prime-age males. And again, prime-age males are defined by the US Census as age 25 to 54, which is, I need not add, a definition that I'm finding increasingly offensive as I head towards that 54-year mark. And what you can see is in the 80s, the employment rate, and this is going to be a big number for you to remember, it's the share of adults that are share of adult males in this case that have jobs. Okay? So these numbers tracked each other between large metropolitan areas, small metropolitan areas, and rural areas. But what you can see over the past 20 years is a gulf has really widened up, where metropolitan area America is much more likely to have employed adults than non-metropolitan area America. Right? And so this rise of joblessness outside of cities is something that we really need to care about. This is the background for this. Okay, when I was born in 1967, fewer than 5% of prime-age males were jobless. Over most of the past decade, more than 15% of prime-age males have been jobless. There's been a tripling of the joblessness rate. Now, you may have read that America's unemployment rate is at, all-time historic lows. That is true, and that's a good sign. But the reason why that is highly misleading is that we have had a massive decrease in the male labor force participation rate. Okay? 5 million men, and this shows the change in prime-age male labor force participation, 5 million men have left the labor force entirely. Right? And they are not better off than the unemployed. They are worse off than the unemployed by almost any measure. These are men who have given up. These are men who have lost their chances of feeling productive on this planet, have lost their social connection that comes from having a job. This is not some minor thing. This is, I think, America's largest unsolved social problem, that we have moved to a place in which vast amounts of the American population feel like they have no chance of succeeding in the labor market any further. And if you think that automation and other forms of technological change are likely to make that better, right, you're more optimistic than I'm able to be even on my best days. This shows what's happened to female labor force participation. And that rose until about 2000, and then it's leveled off. I will come back to this, but female labor force participation or female employment to population rates and male employment to population rates are fundamentally different things. Women who are not working are typically not much less happy than women who are working. Okay? Women who are not working are generally doing quite socially productive things, mostly taking care of their families and doing other things. This is a complicated issue. I don't have views on this topic on any major way, and certainly my wife wouldn't let me express them if I did. But men who are not working are not doing socially productive things, and they are miserable, okay? And so I'm going to be talking mostly about men, not because the issue of female employment is less important, but because it is more complicated, okay? And it's more difficult to sort of make sense of. Okay, this is the prime-age male not working rates versus the national unemployment rates, and as you can see, national unemployment has come down. The overall not working rate has remained shockingly high, and again, this is because men have left the labor force entirely. This shows the total not working rate and the not working rate for more than a year. And this has gone up to being over 10%. So this is people who have been not working for over a year who are men. Okay? So while this is coming down, we've still kept a very high level of men who are not employed for a year or more. This is cohort level analysis. So these are men who are born before 1940. The red, green, and yellow lines are born 50s, 60s, and 70s. The ones in their 40s all worked much more. They had a much lower joblessness rate throughout all their youth. And then finally, when they were about 40, which is starting in the 1980s when we had the first large manufacturing dislocation, their joblessness rate rose. Among each one of these groups, you see recessions hit them. So the 70 population, when they turned 40, you can see this here, this is born in 1970, they turned 40 around the Great Recession. And you can see the joblessness rate for them rising then. This is the group born in 1960. Okay, this is 2007 for them. This is when they joined, and their joblessness rate is rising. Now, the group born in 1980, okay, that's the one that's still a lot older than you guys are, but they have joblessness rates that are higher than any of the other cohorts throughout their entire lives. Okay, so it may eventually converge, but it's a different America than it was. This is by education rate, and you may occasionally read articles about how college doesn't pay, and assuredly there are people who should do something else other than go to college, but on net, vastly more social problems occur among people with less education, including joblessness. So this is the jobless rate for people with less than high school education. So that's been over 20%. This is people with exactly high school. So this was at 15% over this period. This is some college, this is 10%, and this is graduating from college. So this is about 5% at the peak. So as you can see, there's a fourfold difference between people who don't graduate from high school and people with college in terms of the joblessness rate. Really an enormous education gradient, which is, of course, my way of saying just stay in school, get your diploma. Okay. I came of age in an era in which we compared America, which seemed to work hard, versus Europeans, which didn't. That world is no longer accurate. Okay? So this shows the male employment to population ratios, not compared with all Europeans. So the southern European countries would look much worse, but we're comparing us to what I think of as being reasonably comparable countries: Australia, France, Canada, Germany, and the UK. Right? We're sort of a little low, but not terribly lower than they are in terms of the overall employment to population ratios. But if you just look at our labor force participation ratio, we're the lowest of this group by a substantial margin. We have more men who have left the labor force entirely than any of these other groups. This is an America that is not working. And this is the map. Okay? So this is the map of America's not working rates. So the light rates are ones in which you have less than 10%. The dark are sometimes over 26%. So this is 1 in 4 prime-age males who are not working. And you can see the hardest hit area, the most troubled area, is America's eastern heartland, which begins in Louisiana and Mississippi down here, runs up through eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, and Appalachia, and ends up in the Rust Belt cities of the north. Right? The eastern heartland is the epicenter, and I'll come back to this again, of American joblessness and American despair. There also is a big area in the southwest. These are typically not Phoenix, which is relatively low, but the lower density parts of Arizona and New Mexico. And of course, this is north of the Bay Area and south of Seattle. There are large areas of joblessness in both Oregon and northern California. Along the East Coast, right, most of it is very light. So these are these coastal cities where joblessness rates are very low. This is the same map for 1980, using the same colors. As you can see, there's still a bit of an eastern heartland showing up, but just the differences are so much smaller. Right? There's almost no different. There's almost nothing that you can see relative to what you saw. This is for women. And the gap really seems different. So for women, there's much more of a north-south divide, which looks more cultural to me, than an eastern heartland, western heartland, coastal divide. So there are still interesting regional patterns, but here, and of course the numbers are higher. Female non-employment is different, but it doesn't have the same geographic pattern. Now you can see some other variables which go along reasonably well with this eastern heartland depiction. So these are opioid fatalities, drug poisoning fatalities in 2013. So again, you can see this sort of concentration in the eastern heartland, also high levels in Oklahoma, and of course, again, the West. Nevada looks much worse on this than they do among joblessness. This is where the federal government spends money, and as you can see, federal government expenditures per capita are much higher in the eastern heartland, where these joblessness numbers are worse than in other areas. And again, this reflects that more people who are receiving aid from government programs like disability in these particular places. So I'm now going to give you a bunch of sort of a time series history of these three heartlands, and I'm going to divide the states into three groups. Coastal states are those that touch the two oceans. Eastern heartland are those cities that were admitted to the Union before 1840. Western heartland are those states that were admitted after 1840. So that's my arbitrary grouping. So you can see this is our eastern heartland area where we've included Louisiana but not Iowa. And this roughly corresponds to areas that were part of the industrial heartland of the United States 100 years ago. So first of all, the not working rate. So blue is going to be coasts, green is going to be western heartland, and red is going to be eastern heartland. And you can see there is clearly this division. In the late 1990s, the coasts and the eastern heartland were about the same. Since about 1997, this hierarchy has been maintained, where the eastern heartland always has a higher not working rate than the other two regions. But note, the western heartland is actually doing better by this measure. And an important takeaway from this, it is wrong to think of the US as flyover states and the rest. Okay, the Western Heartland just looks totally different in its economic performance from the Eastern Heartland. One area is, it may not be as rich as the coastal states, but it's doing a perfectly good job of employing its citizens. The other Eastern Heartland is not. Okay, this is prime-age female employment. There's really no difference between this, and this is, again, part of my point. The female employment rates just look very different. This is overall GDP growth, and here the standout is not the coast. Right? The standout in terms of GDP growth is the Western Heartland, in part because it's starting from a lower base, it's starting from less economic activity, but as you can see, the fastest GDP growth areas were places like Texas or the Dakotas that have really expanded enormously in terms of their GDP since the mid-1960s. Of course, the coastal states are doing perfectly respectably. The Eastern Heartland looks much worse by almost any measure. This is GDP per worker. Okay, so the overall GDP is growing faster in the Western Heartland. GDP per worker, which also corresponds to wages, is growing more quickly in the coastal states. Okay, so how do you square this? Why is GDP per worker growing more quickly in the coastal states and overall GDP growing more quickly in the Western Heartland? Well, okay, I skipped over this. It's because of the number of people growing more quickly. So what's happening is that the population is growing quickly in the Western Heartland, in part because they don't put barriers to building, in part because they don't make it difficult to lay down houses for ordinary people to come and live. Right? You can move to Texas and actually buy a house for an affordable price. You can't do that in coastal California. And so population growth has what's been generating that large GDP growth. Now, the last of these three facts that I want to highlight, the three regions that I want to highlight, and you had Sir Angus Deaton giving his talk about deaths of despair 2 years ago. This is prime-age male mortality. From 1970 to mid-1980s, it's declining everywhere. Then you have a period in which the coastal states look the worst. This is the era of AIDS and the era of gang killing associated with crack. Since the mid-1990s, the coasts have plummeted, and now we're going along about the same as the Western Heartland. The Eastern Heartland has remained at a higher mortality rate than it had in the mid-1980s. So there have been practically no health differences for prime-age male death rates over a 35-year period in the Eastern Heartland. This is an amazing fact, and one that we should all be concerned about. Okay, now, what explains the Eastern Heartland's poor performance? I'm going to take a very simple view of economic growth and economic success. It's about two things. It's about education, and it's about the quality of your political and legal institutions. This is how I understand why some countries are rich or some countries are poor, some cities are rich and some cities are poor, and some regions are rich and some regions are poor. Okay, so this is education. This is as of 2015. The least educated parts of the country are the Eastern Heartland. This reflects two things. This reflects the industrial past. You didn't have high levels of education in the old industrial cities because a 17-year-old kid didn't need to go to college to get a great job working on an assembly line. Right? You had great opportunities in the factories, and so people didn't invest in schools. At the same time, you also had the Jim Crow South, which was in many ways the least educated part of the country during this time period. This is what's happened to education. So if you go back to 1980, the Western Heartland and the coast were about as educated. Right? Hence the Western Heartland success. Over the past 30, 40 years, the coasts have become more educated relative to the Western Heartland, but the Eastern Heartland started with a big deficit. It's caught up a bit, and maybe this augurs well, but it started far behind. And so low education really helps explain a significant part about why their economic performance has been poor. The second thing is bad politics. This is a map of the corruption across America's states. This is a methodology that I used in a paper called Corruption in America about 15 years ago that uses the federal cases against local officials for corruption violations to measure the level of corruption. Now you can just look at it. Again, the Eastern Heartland stands out. This is an area in which political institutions are weakest, are least likely to actually respond to their citizens' needs, and are most corrupt. So if you think about a world in which sort of the quality of the human capital and the quality of the politics are central, the Eastern Heartland suffers in both ways. It also faces the legacy of this manufacturing hangover. This is where manufacturing was heaviest in 1980. It's declined substantially, and as manufacturing has declined, and this shows the change in manufacturing share, right? Those places over here are the places where manufacturing has declined the most. This shows us the change in the jobless rate for men without high school degrees. So this 0.4 number means there's been a 40% increase in this area among men in joblessness among men with a high school degree. So the areas where the manufacturing jobs left, these are the areas in which the men drifted into joblessness. Now, one point that I want to make, right, and this should be something all of you know, is that those people who think that we're going to solve this problem just by cutting people checks with this sort of false panacea of universal basic income miss the point. That happiness comes from doing, not from owning. Okay? And this is you see this so clearly in the happiness data. This shows people who are earning more than 50K a year, earning between 35 and 50, between earning less than 35 and not working. And what you see, this is the percent of people reporting very low levels of satisfaction. Okay, so this is about 2% for people earning more than 50K, men earning more than 50K. That rises to 4%, earning between 35 and 50, rises to 6%, earning less than 35, rises to 18% for people who are jobless. Being jobless just looks nothing like being a low-income earner in terms of overall human misery. And it's important to remember that happiness, has much more to do with feeling like you have a sense of purpose on this planet and feeling like you're actually surrounded by some people who, even in crappy jobs, are often people who actually can lend you support, make you feel good about yourself, right? So my mother-in-law, who went here in the 1950s, her dad went into a coal mine at 11 outside of Scranton and worked there for 48 years, right? By all measures, a terrible job, a job that all of us should feel good about, that we don't have to go into a coal mine at age 11. But this is a man who felt deep purpose, deep pride that he sent his daughter here, and there was no question that he did not feel satisfied with his life, right? Because he felt like he was actually doing something that mattered on this planet. These men who are long-term unemployed, who are living on their parents' couches, have none of that. They have nothing but a feeling of drift. And if they're living alone, these unhappiness levels get up to 40%, right? 35%, right? Just enormous sense of purposeness. So anything that you think is going to solve the problem just by cutting checks works in the wrong direction. What we know about experiments like universal basic income from the negative income taxes of the 1970s mean if you just cut people checks, they work less, not more, which is going to make the problem worse, not better. Okay, now what do these men do? I said earlier that, the men weren't engaging in lots of socially productive activities. And this would look entirely different if I showed you women who were in the formal labor force versus not. The women who are not in the formal labor force do a ton of work taking care of their families, taking care of their kids. What do men do? Well, let's compare employed with not working Eastern Heartland, just as an example. Okay? So they go from working 382 minutes a week down to 28 minutes a week. So they still are doing a little bit of work. So that's 382 minutes a day. So it's 6 hours down to 28 minutes. How many of those minutes go into caring for others? Okay, 9. 42 minutes to 51 minutes. Those men who are jobless spend 9 extra minutes a day caring for others out of the 360 minutes a day that they've spent less working. Where does the time go? Well, a bit of it goes into sleep. They're sleeping about 70 minutes more a day. That's the 529 to 604 number. And then what they're mainly doing is their TV watching rises to 5 hours, although I think video gaming is beginning to eat into that to a little degree. So what you're seeing is people who are, half of them are on painkillers, right? And they're spending 5 hours a day watching television. This is not a life that naturally leads to a sense of purpose and a sense of achievement. Now, this world, a world in which America has wild regional differences in social misery, in joblessness, is a world that should make us rethink the issue of should we be doing different policies in different parts of America. I have been among those urban economists who have often, if not always, warned against the dangers of trying to spend $100 billion trying to bring New Orleans back after Katrina, right? After Hurricane Katrina. I got a lot of hate mail over that by pointing out that you could give each New Orleans family $1 million instead of building the infrastructure that was being suggested, and that they probably would be better off with $1 million somewhere else, right? I have often argued against a variety of what I conceive to be wasteful government policies to bring back declining areas. And one time when I went to Buffalo, New York, they threatened to slip my tires because of saying such things. And in some sense, if there's a mantra of this that I preached, it was help poor people, not poor places, right? To focus on people-oriented policies, rather than place-oriented policies. But we're living in a different world. We're living in a world in which there are at least 2 differences, right? One of which is that joblessness is not new, and secondly, America is becoming more sclerotic geographically. The world in which America was fluid, in which we moved across counties easily, is changing. And I think that should lead us to revisit this. But just to stress, it's not as if America's income differences across space are getting larger. In 1950, the poorest state in the Union was Mississippi. And there were 18 states that had per capita incomes that were at least double that of Mississippi, if not more. Today, the poorest state in the Union is still Mississippi, and there is not a single state with a per capita income that is double that in Mississippi. There's been a compression of income. But joblessness is different than income differences. Joblessness itself creates what economists often call a Pigouvian externality that's associated with the fiscal payments, and there is a good reason to argue for, and that's what I'm going to use some of my last minutes, to argue for policies that are about targeting policies, not necessarily redistributing across space, to have policies that are well matched to the particular joblessness problems of America's Eastern Heartland. Okay, so let's talk about the growing geographic sclerosis of America. The most striking fact of this is just the decline of migration rates. We used to be a country on the move. We are much less on the move now. right? For 40 years prior to 1992, right, more than 6% of Americans changed counties every year, right? This has been below 4% since the mid-2000s, right? So we are much less mobile. Why does mobility matter? Well, in 1950, you figured if they didn't like Mississippi, they'd just go to Chicago, right? We figured we were in a country that was moving fairly rapidly. Today, we're less confident about that. Moreover, right, who moves? This shows the skills of people who stay. That's along the x-axis. This shows the skills of people who move, right? The more unskilled the area, the larger the difference is between the skills of the mover, so that's the difference between this dot and the 45-degree line, and the skills of the stayer. So what happens when people leave the Eastern Heartland is the most skilled people leave, and the people who are left behind are left even more rudderless. If you think that human capital is the bedrock on which these places survive, then in fact the emigration, the outmigration of skilled people is actually making the problem worse, not better. Added changes. Migration, especially migration of the less skilled, used to head towards rich areas. That's not happening anymore. That's ended, and that's the work of Peter Ganong and Danny Shoag, partially because successful areas make it increasingly difficult to build. So America has always been a country where there are productivity differences across place. And we have always been a country in which we moved from less productive places to more productive places. 200 years ago, as America's transportation network started to blossom, farmers left the rocky soil of New England and moved to the Ohio River Valley. And nobody said you couldn't put up your balloon frame houses on this frontier. Then at the end of the 19th century, people moved into tenements. And nobody said you can't build the new skyscrapers there. Right? In the 1930s, Okies left the Dust Bowl to move to California. No one said you couldn't come to California and experience this new Eden. Right? But today, if you want to come to be a bartender in San Francisco, right, and you earn $37,000 a year as a bartender in San Francisco and $19,000 a year in Atlanta, right? So there's a huge income difference. But why don't you move to San Francisco? Because the housing costs eat up more than that difference, because it is vastly more expensive to live there. And it's vastly more expensive to live there because we don't allow the housing to be built, because we have moved into a world in which we've put together a stultifying array of land use regulations that make it impossible to deliver mass-produced housing in the way that America has throughout most of its history. We see a change in the way that skills converge over time. So historically, often places that were less successful became more successful. Now, what we've seen over the past 60 years is the places that started with a slight skill advantage, like Boston, for example, have seen that skill advantage widen over time as skilled people have flocked to be around other skilled people. And the fact that my colleague, Robert Barrow, with Javier Sally-Martin, who was also a Lucia lecturer, documented 30 years ago that incomes converged over space, meaning that places that were initially richer had less income growth, places that were initially poorer had faster income growth, which would lead you not to worry about Mississippi 60 years ago, because after all, it would catch up, as indeed it did. Right? That fact has largely vanished, and oddly, it largely vanished at exactly the time period when Barrow and Sally-Martin documented its existence. Okay? Sort of like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. This shows the sort of end of income convergence. So it's basically been flat over the last 30 years. Poorer places don't grow more quickly, as opposed to the 150 years beforehand. And if you want to look at not working rates, right, they're not converging at all. This is the percent of prime-age males who were not working in 1980 on the percent of prime-age males who were not working in 2010. This correlation is over 80%, and the coefficient is more than 1, meaning it's looking like an explosive process. Right? These are permanent pockets of joblessness that exist in America. Now, is geographic sclerosis an excuse for revisiting place-based policies, aids to particular areas? So the usual counter-arguments for any form of place-based aid are, well, right, subsidizing declining places keeps people in dysfunctional local economies. That's true, right? That's one of the reasons not to encourage people to stay in New Orleans after Katrina, but it's less important if people aren't moving anyway, okay? Counter-argument 2, subsidizing any place leads to capitalization in rents, meaning if I plunk down a fancy art museum in a former industrial town in Spain, like the Guggenheim Bilbao, then I'm going to bid up rents and cause gentrification, and that may end up being bad for the poor people who live nearby if they don't like contemporary art, rather than good. Right? It's not necessarily helping the place, doesn't necessarily target the person. Again, as people are less mobile, that may be less important. Counter-argument number 3, some place-based policies can create pockets of high unemployment and low human capital. So policies that particularly favor joblessness in particular areas, so having, let's say, for example, the more generous welfare payments of Illinois induced East St. Louis to become the poorest place in the country because people in the St. Louis metropolitan area would go over the state to Illinois. That creates sort of pockets of joblessness that are particularly worrisome. That's something we still should worry about, but we should make sure that we design policies that don't create that. And lastly, infrastructure-based policies can lead to monumental waste. Well, that's still true, okay? And we need to be very careful about this, right? So this is Detroit's People Mover monorail, okay? A piece of colossal human idiocy. And this is something that was dreamed up by the Ford administration. Someone had obviously visited Walt Disney World in the mid-1970s and decided what Detroit needed in the midst of its economic travails was a monorail, okay? Now, what Detroit needed was safer streets and better schools for its children. It's a city in which you can drive around. Look at the streets. Streets are empty, right? You can run a bus on these streets at any speed you want. The last thing you need is a monorail to go above it. And yet, because this monorail was evaluated not with the tools of cost-benefit analysis, but with the magic that this monorail will bring Detroit back, right? This place-making magic enables all sorts of flights of human idiocy to take roots, and that we must always be worried about. Okay. There are three arguments for place-based policies that economists give credence to. Sorry, these slides are a little bit dense. Okay? Argument number one is all this magic of placemaking means that, if I manage to move high human capital people from one place to another or just create more density, I may then engender more economic productivity in one place versus another. Okay? That's true, but think about it. We don't really know enough about how these functions, how these magical things to work. I think if I move 1,000 highly educated people from New York to West Virginia, I will make West Virginia better and New York worse. Okay? And I don't think the free market will get it right. But I'm not sure if the effect will be better or worse of these two things. I'm not sure if that's a good idea or a bad idea, because New York may lose less than West Virginia gains, or New York may lose more than West Virginia gains. And there's no way that we're ever going to get enough degree of precision about our economic estimation to think that this is a sound basis for policy. So throw this one out. Number two, place-based insurance. So in 1967, right, Detroit, Boston had about the same incomes. Today, Boston has 40% higher incomes. Maybe we should offer insurance against, surprise changes to the local economy. Perfectly reasonable idea. The problem is the only real unit of geography that the federal government could offer insurance on would be how well your state economy goes. And state differences make almost no difference. States only explain 1.2% of income differences. So you'd be putting together a huge insurance program and achieving almost nothing. You could imagine if you insured against tinier shocks, maybe it would do more, so your local neighborhood. But how in the world is the federal government ever going to manage a program like that? Third, okay, place-based argument number three. And I'm gonna make this case first about housing subsidies. Federal government has something called low-income housing tax credit, which subsidizes the construction of affordable housing in all the different states of the union. Now, I want you to think about different housing, how housing is built in Texas, housing in Detroit, and housing in San Francisco. Okay? Housing in San Francisco is valued vastly more than construction costs. And so a government program that leans towards subsidizing more construction is probably benign or reasonably benign. Okay? Texas, they build at $80 a square foot in Texas as soon as you take a whistle or you snap your fingers, right? This is an area in which supply of housing is completely elastic. Right? In a world of elastic housing, subsidies make absolutely no sense whatsoever. You're just going to give a couple of lucky Texas home builders this subsidy, and you're not going to impact the supply of housing at all, or the price of housing, which is ultimately going to be tied down. As all of you know from your economics classes, in a world of elastic supply, the supply price determines the price of this thing. And that's what you're going to be seeing. So you're going to do no good that. What about Detroit? Well, Detroit, they wouldn't build anything without the subsidies. Okay, but you don't really want them to be building anything anyway. More than, even in 1980, more than 90% of the homes in central Detroit were valued significantly less than construction costs. How in the world does it make sense to have a federal policy that encourages more building in that area? Okay, and so, you have different markets, and having a single national policy makes absolutely no sense. Same thing is true for minimum wages. A minimum wage of $15 an hour has absolutely no impact on Seattle whatsoever. Right? There have been a whole bunch of studies. Maybe it decreases a little bit of employment to low-skilled people. Maybe it doesn't. Right? But it's a hard thing to see. Does anyone seriously think that a $15 minimum wage won't wreak havoc on the labor markets of West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky? Right? Does anyone possibly think that these places will maintain their slender hope on employment if this policy is enacted? Similarly, right, having an employment subsidy, right, which I think is the most sensible thing, essentially reducing the cost for creating jobs for less skilled Americans or creating economic benefits to employ them. Right? This is a thing that makes much more sense in West Virginia than it does in Seattle. And I think that's the best case for some degree of federal intervention, is to try and encourage job creation through something like an employment subsidy. Why would you want to encourage job creation? Well, mostly because of human misery. But there are also the existence of various fiscal externalities, which are that people who are working pay taxes, right, and people who are not working get money from government support. Arthur Cecil Pigou, the great godfather of public finance, wrote 105 years ago that if you have a difference in taxes paid and benefits received between working and not working, you want to engage in some form of subsidization of working. right? And that's the basic idea behind programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has successfully encouraged people to work over the last 40 years. This is the difference in tax payments. If you're not working, living alone, you don't pay taxes, and if you're working with people, you do. There also are costs that the not working impose on their community, right? So this is the share of people who are not working who are living with their parents. So, maybe the parents are happy with this, but about 30% of the long-term not working are living with their parents, as opposed to under 10% for those people who are not. I'm going to skip over that. So we estimate that the direct financial cost of joblessness is about 36% of low-income wages. So that means there's a fairly substantial fiscal benefit of encouraging people to work. The point of the Seattle being different from West Virginia is if you just think that there's a distribution of workers, okay, and you've got a very small number that is single peak, something like a normal distribution, you've got a very small number of jobless workers in Seattle, you're down here with very small number of people who are on the margin of working and not working, whereas you have a lot more people on the margin of working and not working in West Virginia. The more people on the margin of working and not working, the more unemployment subsidy will bring people in. The more that essentially bribing firms to create jobs will bring people in. Now, just to go through the ideas of this, Larry Summers, my co-author on this, and I have slightly different versions. Larry, because Larry's a nice guy and a former Secretary of the Treasury. Larry's variant is nice. Because I like saying things that poke at people, my version is mean, okay? So the Larry version, which is nice, is let's just imagine we have a big pot of federal money that we're going to use to encourage employment. Okay, where should we use that money? Should we use that equally in Seattle and West Virginia? No, we should throw it at West Virginia. We should have an employment tax credit. Maybe it should be done in the way it's similar to the Earned Income Tax Credit, or maybe it's cutting the payroll tax for firms that create jobs in West Virginia. We should target this towards high joblessness areas. The Ed version is a little bit meaner, which says, well, because I don't want to encourage people to live in areas that are dysfunctional, why don't I keep it fiscally neutral? And I'm going to lower the base payment for something like disability, but then enable people on disability to keep more of their income. Okay, so I'm going to enable our policies to be more job-friendly in declining areas than in other places like Seattle. So both of these are about essentially making work pay and making job creation pay more. This is some calibration. So I want to end on what I think we can do on this, and this is just implementing these ideas. So the first thing I think that's out there is doing something to try and make jobs pay. So if you want to, think about it as creating a living wage in West Virginia of $12 or $14. But instead of imposing it by regulation on employers in a way that will surely kill job creation, do it with an employment subsidy that actually makes it more attractive for firms to create jobs. So top up the wages workers receive in these areas, but don't do it by imposing the penalties on the firms themselves. Right? Because every time you do something like raising the minimum wage, you're making it less attractive to create jobs in these areas, not more attractive to create jobs in these areas. And this seems like something that we should be very afraid of. So reform social programs like disability, like Section 8 housing vouchers, like food stamps, all of which tax earnings, all of which make it less attractive to work. If you do more to make these programs be less punitive against working, reduce the tax that each one of these programs imposes on working, particularly in the Eastern Heartland. Do more around education, around skills that matter. Have experimental vocational training programs that actually are, if you're trying to train someone to be a plumber, to be a carpenter, to be a computer programmer, you don't need to actually do this as a separate schooling system. Do it after school. Do wraparound programs on the summer, on weekends. Have them be randomized. Have them be experimentally evaluated. You know whether or not someone's learned how to be a plumber pretty quickly. You can see immediately after the program is over. You can pay those programs that have trained good plumbers. You can choose not to pay those programs that have not trained good programs, right? So there are things we can do that are spatially targeted. And what we shouldn't do is give up on a huge amount of Americans and say we're just going to cash checks and give people universal basic income. Because this is a way that's going to lead to an area in which 40% of America ends up being permanently on the dole. And this is an America that is miserable. This is an America without hope. And this is an America that we be caught in political battles, right, over how big that subsidy will be that will dominate American politics for the next generation. It is important for all of you, right, not that you necessarily receive a check going forward, but that you find a way to use the limited amount of time that you've been given on this planet to do something good with your life that's of use, right? That is the point. And government policies that work against that objective are pernicious. We want government policies to encourage entrepreneurs to figure out ways to actually enable people to fulfill their dreams. Every underemployed American is a failure of entrepreneurial imagination, and we want to make sure that we have public policies that encourage job creation rather than eliminating job creation. Don't forget, most spatial programs are unwise at best, right? So transportation, new highways for the Eastern Heartland is not what they need. That's the bulk of what the Appalachian Regional Commission has done over the last 50 years. And the problem that America faces is not impossibility of transportation. And other clever solutions like the Bilbao Art Museum are even less plausible. At least this one's a good museum, right? This is the Sheffield's National Center for Popular Music in England, which was supposed to bring Sheffield back. This one was a colossal failure, okay? Within a year, it had shut down. So this is not an excuse to engage in every form of place-based bringing something back. You've got to be smart about it, right? You've got to be targeted about it. And I in some sense, let me just end with three sort of claims. One of which is it's very easy in the modern political landscape to get caught in sort of a sterile battle of more government or less government, right? The point is better government, right? The point is government that's actually more effective. Now, effective government is not government that actually thinks the government is itself the answer, right? Effective government empowers the innovation of people. It empowers the creativity of people. And it uses the tools of capitalism. It uses the tools of incentives to solve social problems. The third point, okay, is that I can easily imagine what people with less human capital are going to be doing in Philadelphia in 50 years, right? There are service sector jobs, no matter what automation does. There will be service sector jobs for people who have a nice smile and have ability to get along well with other people, right? We've seen an enormous explosion of service sector jobs after the declining of manufacturing in the 1980s, and that can still happen, right? We've seen what Uber has done in terms of creating a whole new service sector market. That's a market that's sort of unfair, that's difficult for men, because particularly like 52-year-old men like me who are not necessarily so great at being nice to people, right? That's a handicap that we're going to have to learn to get over, right, if we're going to survive in this service sector employment. But service sector jobs easily exist in the coastal cities that are thriving. I don't know what the jobs of the future will be like in West Virginia. I don't know what they'll be like in Eastern Kentucky. That is the leap of faith of economics. But I know that, for millennia, amazing things, miraculous things have been happening through the creativity of individual entrepreneurs, individual dreamers. I do not think that America lacks those people. They just need to be nudged towards creating jobs where those jobs are needed the most. And a targeted employment subsidy, disability reform, and better training, better education, specifically vocational training, but other forms as well, can help to make that a reality. So with that, let me break for Q&A.
Any questions on this side?
Thank you.
Just get the ball rolling.
Please. Ask me about my standard errors. Let's do it.
Where they cost you. So I actually have a different question. It seems that part of the direction of your talk was built on a lack of or a drop in mobility in the United States. And it seems like it might be important to understand what's driving that. So we can think about, for example, people who don't need to move because they can telecommute. We can think about being very hard to sell a house that's worth less than the mortgage. We can think about a lot of different reasons, but it seems like understanding that might be an important part of the world.
So the work by student Raven Sachs is good on this, on understanding the decline of this. It doesn't really, actually I can move to this, it doesn't line up well with the Great Recession. So it's not like it's decline of, it's not like it, so if you just look at when the years change. So it's sort of starting overall, and it's even starting in 2000, so it's declining before the Great Recession happens. It's then moved along, as you say, by house lock being a real thing, but there's sort of this steady decline from the 1980s onward, and the sort of intra-county stuff, it's clearly much steeper before this. So this is within counties, this is across counties. So I think it's hard to think that house lock alone is explaining it. Or, you know, the telecommuting numbers are tiny relative to this. So it's hard to think that that's what's going on. I don't think that we fully understand it. I mean, there's a hypothesis that is that the Americans before 1995 all used to move first and then jobs later, as opposed to the Europeans who always had it. You wouldn't move from Stuttgart to Dusseldorf unless you had a job offer in Europe. Whereas in the US, you know, think about Mary Tyler Moore showing up in Minneapolis in 1970 saying, hire me, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's a different thing. Whereas today, you know, you don't move until you have a job, which means you don't have this mobility-related job search going on. I think that's one possibility. But it's a critical question, and I sort of think we need more research in this area. Absolutely.
Markets, you have couples, and you have many, many more couples where both work, and it's hard to move if you have to have two jobs. And I think if you have children too, and childcare and all that, that's really grown, and I think that adds to a lot of immobility.
Absolutely, and it also helps explain the rise of many cities. So the work of Dora Costa and Matt Kahn on power couples, which shows the increasing agglomeration, particularly of high-skilled men and women in particular metro areas.
Where more women work than
Yeah, it's the power couples phenomenon in cities is about it's the need for the job match is higher at the higher end of the skill area. So that's why you see them being more urbanized relative to the less skilled couples. So you still need both to work. Absolutely, the probability of working is higher, but there's not the same urbanization push because of the ease of finding. It's much easier if you're a less skilled person in the service sector to find an employer in lots of different areas. Whereas if you're a lawyer, if you're a biologist, right, you need to be in a large metropolitan area to find your job. That's the idea and what Power Couples documents. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Mine's more of an observation, if you could touch upon this more. Had to do with affordable housing, and my experience is just working in the field. It has to do more with real estate developers, and I don't want to blame them, but real estate developers who want a certain profit versus what is affordable housing in suburban Philadelphia versus Burlington County, New Jersey, or Delaware. So how do we get the municipalities, the counties, even the developers to come to some kind of understanding that mixed use is good in the community for not just residential, commercial, institutional, but also for housing in general? But what are your thoughts on that?
So great question. So three observations. One, we have transformed our world of what affordable housing means, and it's a transformation that I think is deeply unfortunate. So what real affordability means is that anyone can come to any city and rent an apartment for a reasonable price, right, for $1,000 a month. You don't need to be lotteried into some special thing. You don't need to be mean tested in, but housing is affordable, meaning that you just show up. And that's still true in much of the American Western Heartland. You just show up and you rent an apartment for $800 a month, and you're done. We have transformed that, particularly in the coastal America, to a world in which affordable housing means housing that was specifically built and targeted for a particular population that you need to be lucky enough to get. Okay? I think that is unfortunate because, in fact, by moving from this general affordability metric to saying how many affordable housing units did you build, you enable politicians to take their eye off the ball. That this sort of clustered of a few affordable housing, so my own highly NIMBYist, not in my backyard, suburb that I live in outside of Boston, recently had a headline celebrating the construction of exactly one affordable housing unit, as if this was somehow or other helpful for any larger social objective. Right? And yet this enabled all the politicians likely to come together and celebrate what a fabulous thing that was. So that's my first point, that like affordable housing is, real affordable housing means large-scale production of ordinary units for ordinary people. Secondly, do you expect real estate developers to be selfish and short-sighted and profit-oriented? Yeah, you do, right? That's true of most of humanity, and we all hope for a humanity that rises above sin and foolishness. But let's remember that we're all precious, even though we often fail in these regards. And I think that a public policy that can only succeed if we are a nation of angels is not one that's likely to be all that successful. So we need to make sure that we have public policies that are designed to accept the unfortunate human weaknesses that often exist. Third answer, so that means if you want affordable housing units, you need to incentivize them the right way. Now, but the larger and more important way of making sure that we create mass affordability in the US is to get rid of the rules that make it difficult to build. Okay, is to make sure we turn back the clock on local land use regulations. We impose cost-benefit analysis on every time a locality imposes a 2-acre minimum lot sizes, or in some areas of Silicon Valley, 60-acre minimum lot sizes, right? Anytime a locality does this, they need to go through a rigorous cost-benefit analysis where they've actually gone through this. Every time you impose an environmental impact review, and all larger projects in California have to go through environmental impact reviews, right? You should be asking not just what's the local environmental impact of building here, but what's the global environmental impact of not building there. Right? Because when you turn off the housing spigot outside of coastal California, outside of San Francisco, it turns on in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It turns on in Las Vegas. It turns on somewhere else. And that somewhere else is almost assuredly less environmentally sensitive than coastal California. By far, the lowest carbon emissions in this country are associated with living in San Francisco Bay or other coastal areas, right? So when you don't build there, you're not being good to the environment, you're being bad to the environment. And I see no way of actually getting to affordability other than by allowing people to build. New York City built 100,000 units a year in the early 1920s, and the city remained affordable to ordinary New Yorkers in a way that sort of is unimaginable today. And so I think it's a world in which we at least have to find some areas of the Northeast where we can actually allow very large-scale building on a grand scale. We can also use this, use the zoning to privilege apartments that are targeted towards middle-income people. We're totally allowed to do that, right? You can speed through the process with that in New York or surrounding areas, but we need to get rid of the regulations. And let me just sort of try and make this a little more tangible for the younger people in this audience, right? One of the ways to understand what's happened in America over the last 40 years is that we have increasingly protected insiders as a result of outsiders. We've used regulations like land use regulations, which make it difficult to build, to shore up the prices of those people who own housing and make it difficult for those people who don't own housing to buy houses. We have an occupational licensing that makes it harder for you to come to a new state and follow a new job. We have rules about entrepreneurship, which particularly afflict the entrepreneurship of the poor relative to the rich. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, no one's going to notice until you have like 1 billion users and have possibly hacked an election, right? If you want to actually start a bodega that sells milk products across the river, you literally have 17 permits that you need to get. That is an outrage. Right? All of these things protect the incumbents and don't allow new people to come in. And that is not a good American. It's not an America that's good for you. That's an America, and the more that you think about regulating the economy, the more that you think of an economy that's going to be dominated by the government and dominated by different rules, right? That's not a government that's friendly to outsiders. That's a government that's going to end up protecting insiders. Unquestionably, we want to make sure that we have a public sector that is targeted towards providing skills for kids who come in the world with less. We want to make sure we have sensible social insurance programs that don't leave people entirely vulnerable. I'm not arguing for a laissez-faire, non-governmental solution, but almost assuredly, you want to have whatever government structures you want to have those ones that enable people to follow their dreams and do new stuff, not ones that protect the existing homeowners and make sure they never pay any costs under any circumstances. Okay, another question. Yeah.
I work in talent, human capital.
Hi, I work in talent, human capital, and we're in this crazy boom of 100 plus straight months of job growth, and one of the things that is consistently talked about in my line of work is the talent gap, is just the sheer number of jobs that are going unfilled because employers can't find the right people to fill them. And we couple that with some other challenging things, like immigration policy is as tight as it's ever been, or tight as it's been a long time. Population growth is at a 30-year low. There's no more people coming. So where are we going to get this talent? Well, it seems, based on what you've just shown us, that there's an awful lot of people out there. So why hasn't worker retraining and upskilling been more successful? Why is it something that needs to come from public policy? Is it something that needs to be private, and organizations should be doing that for their own jobs?
It's a great question. So for the first observation, anytime employers talk about a talent gap, anytime they talk about like how there aren't no workers of skills that they want to get, the first answer to give is, well, why don't you raise the wage? Okay, so raising the wage is the number one answer to actually like solving your talent gap. The second question, though, which is a larger one, which is there are a lot of people and there are a lot of jobs, and there's a mismatch here, and this is exactly right. I think, there are opinions that differ on this. I think that most of the track record on standalone public retraining programs, particularly for people who look like me, are pretty bad. Right? That in fact we have 50 years of randomized controls around job retraining programs, and they're pretty unsuccessful in terms of creating economic benefits for the long run for the person. I don't think that we should give that up, and I think there are some cases which are probably better, but I do think it is something to worry about. In my view, most of the time the right answer is the firm should just do it. That in fact, the right answer is that firms should get in the business of, because that's something a 52-year-old guy can understand, is that you got to go to work, they're going to have standards for you in terms of how much you're going to learn, and if you don't fit those standards, they're going to fire you. Right? And that's a thing which actually works better than some sort of amorphous training program created by some third party. So I think it's exactly the right question, and if you can do anything to encourage the employers that you work with to think about doing in-house training for what they're doing, I think that's an absolutely fantastic thing to do. That's exactly what we need to do in terms of using our underutilized human capital better.
I asked the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina how the worker retraining programs were going, and what data they have to show how well they're doing. And he said, they're going terribly. We have no data.
Unfortunately, that's too often the case. But firms can figure out, firms have the right incentives and the right capacity to figure out how to make, human beings more productive, and that's what needs to happen. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Any thoughts, or is there any early data? Excuse me. Any thoughts, or is there any early data on tax incentivized opportunity zones? Legislation a few years ago. Has that hurt or helped what we're trying to do?
It doesn't do much. It's mostly about incentives around capital investment, not around employment. I think there was a Zillow piece that seemed to show some housing price response to it. I have reproduced this with what I think is more representative data, and the key is to sort of figure out what the treatment control is for the opportunity zones versus not. I think there's no difference in terms of housing prices at all that are associated with this. I don't think people are willing to pay for this more now. Will it actually create more jobs? It's really hard to see how that's going to happen with the structure of the work, but we're going to have to wait more years to get the employment data on this. But I don't think. I mean, one way to see the value of zones is like really good zones are places of experimentation, not places of subsidy. So they're places where, so for example, I co-chaired a committee to try and create an entrepreneurship zone in Boston about 5 years ago. And we were pushing basically two things, one of which was one-stop permitting for businesses in the area, so to try and get through that 17 permit problem. The second of which was sort of targeted vocational training around the schools. Now, would I be in favor of that in all of Boston? Sure, but I can't get that through the legislature, and the idea was you use this area to sort of experiment and see whether or not something works, and then maybe you can scale it up from there. The opportunity zones doesn't have that structure at all. I mean, it's a very targeted sort of, capital-intensive thing. And I don't think it's terrible at all, but it doesn't seem likely that it's going to actually provide the sort of push for less skilled workers that I think we need. But thank you for the question. That's great. Other question? Yes, sir.
Why is there such a dramatic loss in prime age male labor force participation? Like, why haven't we done that?
So there are two. So we can look at the graph for a second. So there are two stories about this, right? One of which is, where's my thing? One of which emphasizes, no, I went the wrong direction. One of which emphasizes labor demand, and the other of which emphasizes labor supply. So the labor demand story says that there were once manufacturing jobs in all these areas. The manufacturing jobs went away, and in the places where the manufacturing jobs disappeared by more, the joblessness rate went up. That is half the story. But it is also true that people in 1965 or 1975 were working at much lower wages than people are working at today. And the other flip of the story is that labor supply has changed, that people are not willing to accept a really low-wage job in the way that they were 50 years ago, in part because they have other options. Right? For 30% of them, they're living on dad's couch or mom's couch. Right? So they have some form of a social safety net, although most of America's social safety net does not help prime-age men who don't have kids, right? The only major program we have that helps these people are disability insurance. So it's more likely to come from the informal social safety net of people around them. In some sense, this is a reflection of the wealth of American society more generally, that you don't need to work if you've got a close relative or a friend who will put up with you on their couch and let you eat at their table. And in some sense, one way to think about why we have, fewer household formations of young adults, more people living with their parents, is precisely because our houses got a lot bigger. I mean, in a world of shotgun shacks and small urban apartments, you really wanted to get out of that apartment as soon as you can. When the parents live in a fairly large suburban home with a fairly nice basement apartment, you don't need to move out in the same way. And so that's I think the two things to focus on: declining demand for physical labor, declining demand for the stuff that men used to do, which involves like carrying stuff, lifting stuff, doing things that don't require being nice to people but require using your body, coupled with the fact that you no longer need to work to survive in the same way, that there are other ways of eking a living that don't involve actually going out and working, and that's the labor supply shift. So those are the two stories. My co-author Larry Summers believes that this is more about labor demand. I think it is at least as much labor supply, but I didn't come to a clear story because we haven't yet fully converged on the relative importance of those two stories, but stay tuned. Okay, sure, absolutely, thank you for the question. Anything else in terms of, yes, sir?
I was really puzzled by that, those regression discontinuities that
Mm-hmm.
you showed about the cities and how there's higher incarceration inside the city.
These are for kids who are living in the school districts, right? So this is the one, yep.
But if you were to look in Europe, would it be completely the reverse? Inside the cities, tend to have higher educational achievements and be safer, and the suburbs are precisely where you start having problems. It's not a city issue. What makes the American city different?
So this is a great question, one in which I've worked on over the years. So it is absolutely true that American cities have historically tended to be poorer than suburban areas. European cities have historically tended to be richer. It's particularly true in France. And it reflects many things. So the simplest answer is the nature of public housing in the banlieues was just different than the nature of public housing in terms of American cities. So that's one simple answer. A second answer has to do, and this is the answer that's given by Bruckner, Thies, and Zanu, has to do with the historic provision of public amenities. So European cities, particularly what we call imperial cities that were built on their ability to extract rents from far-off provinces, right, built magnificent things in the center of the city, and those magnificent things continue to attract rich people today. Paris being perhaps the most obvious example, but also London and Berlin and Rome, right? These are places with fantastic downtowns, which are somewhat different than those of a Detroit or Cleveland in terms of the downtown amenities. There's also a big part of this which is about the nature of transportation. So in my work on public transportation in the U.S. And why do the poor live in cities in the U.S., it specifically focuses on the role of public transportation. So where poor people tend to live in places where you have public transportation access. And in a world in which everyone took the same transportation, you would have the prediction that the rich would live closer than the poor because the rich have a higher opportunity cost of time. But if the rich are generally driving and the poor are taking buses, then it's natural that the people with a much slower transportation technology are going to live closer. That's much more true in the US than it is in Europe, that you have this different transportation mode, which probably reflects both larger American incomes post-war and also a different tax treatment of gasoline that led to a more car-intensive culture in the US. The last point, though, that's really central is America is fairly unique in the way that we link our schools to where you live. Right? We're much more so than most European countries. And you can imagine that and consequently, whichever area attracts the poor people is going to have to deal with the added burden of helping kids who start with less. And that creates a huge amount of incentive for people to leave central city school districts in the US. You can imagine that if you either moved to, take your pick, left wing or right wing, if you either moved to sort of a Milton Friedman world in which it was all vouchers, in which where you lived made absolutely no difference, but you could take advantage of whatever schools were nearby, you could easily imagine that kids in cities would actually have better options because the urban edge at competition and innovation would actually make urban voucher schools more attractive than their suburban equivalents. Or take the French regulatory model, right? It's 3 o'clock on a Thursday. We know what every child in every school in France is studying in the 3rd grade, right? That's at least the old model of this. A world in which you sort of have uniform educational quality across space is one in which this becomes irrelevant as well. Either model gets rid of this huge incentive of people to leave cities to get better schools for their kids, which is in fact by far the greatest burden that American cities are facing. So this is not a new problem in the US, but it is a very real problem, but it's one that is not at all natural to cities. And that's why I'm grateful for your comment, right? There's no Frenchman has ever thought that I need to leave Paris to get better schools for my kids. No Englishman has ever thought I need to leave London to get better schools for their kids. But millions of Americans have thought they needed to leave Philadelphia, New York, and Boston to get better schools for their kids. One more question? Yes, sir.
So I'm in Massachusetts, where I know the public school systems are generally pretty strong.
I don't look. I mean, I don't think there's. I'm going to turn this into a more general question of public versus private provision of everything, right? I think there are great things about free competitive markets in lots of areas. There are great incentives that are created by the profit motive. But it is also true that profit-making companies have an incentive to shirk on the quality of affordable housing because it's not necessarily in their objective to do that. They have the incentive in the developing world to bribe the heck out of the governments to extract whatever rents that they possibly could. You can look at the Widener family fortune. Harvard's fanciest library is Widener Library. Was built here in Philadelphia. And the common story that's told is what the Widener system was they ran their private traction, the private public transportation system, through the streets of Philadelphia. And the reason that they became rich is they were particularly expert in bribing the city council, right? And what they would do is they would get long leases on public streets for pennies on the dollar, and so this enabled them to create this local monopoly that they got by essentially bribing the local government. Their famous protege, Charles Yerkes, then used the same method in Chicago, before then moving to London and being critical in the electrification of the tube. So there are bad things that private providers do. On the other hand, there are good things that private providers do, like cut costs, like being able to fire people if they should fire, and so forth. Same thing is true in schools, right? There are great things about private schools in lots of ways. On the other hand, they have incentives to cream skin and not necessarily attract the poorest kids. They have incentives to cut quality in some areas. I think before the length of evidence that we had on charter schools, I think I was more just sanguine in a sort of Friedman-esque view that competition would solve all these problems. I actually don't believe that. I think there are lots of great things about charter schools in central Boston, but there are lots of places in which charter schools have fallen short. So do I stand on the side of favoring more competition among schools, more options particularly for poor families? 100%. Do I want to see more things that enable sort of, every kid in every neighborhood in the U.S. to have different options for them to go to school and not to face a single monopoly public provider? Sure. But do I think that the eventual answer is going to be a world in which public education has vanished? No. And I think we should also be focusing on how to make our public schools better, as well as how to provide different alternatives to them. So thank you for your question on that. And again, the line here that's critical is Deng Xiaoping's, right? It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And right, we want schools that train our kids, and we should not be, in this area as in any other area, let ideology get in the way of being ruthlessly pragmatic about caring for the least fortunate Americans.